The sun cast long shadows across the weathered headstone as Owen Novak knelt in the dry grass, his calloused fingers tracing the engraved letters of his wife's name, the pain in his chest as fresh as the day he'd laid her in the ground 6 months ago. The distant cry of a hawk overhead broke the silence of the lonely hilltop cemetery, but it wasn't until the soft clearing of a throat behind him that Owen realized he was no longer alone with his grief. Dust and Redemption, the Colorado Territory, 1876. Owen Novak didn't turn immediately when he heard the hesitant footsteps approaching. His broad-shouldered frame remained hunched over the simple wooden cross that marked his wife's final resting place. Sarah Novak, beloved wife, 1853–1875. 22 years old when the fever took her, along with their unborn child. "Excuse me, sir?" The voice was soft, feminine, and trembling with what might have been fear or exhaustion. Owen slowly rose to his full height, brushing the dust from his worn denim pants before turning to face the intruder on his private grief. She stood no more than 15 feet away, a young woman with dirty blonde hair escaping a once neat bun. Her dress was travel-stained and her boots worn nearly through. In her arms, she cradled a small bundle wrapped in a faded blue blanket. A baby, no more than a few months old from the size of it. The woman's face was smudged with dirt, but beneath it Owen could see she was pretty, with delicate features and wide, desperate eyes. "Can we stay with you tonight?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the rustling of the prairie grass in the evening breeze. Owen's brow furrowed beneath the brim of his dusty Stetson. "Madam, I don't even know who you are." "My name is Eleanor Lawson," she replied, shifting the bundle in her arms. "This is my son, Thomas." As if on cue, the baby made a small whimpering sound. "We've been traveling for days. We have nowhere else to go." Owen's weathered face remained impassive as he studied the pair. She was young, perhaps 20, but her eyes held the weariness of someone much older. Running from something, or someone, that much was clear. "My ranch is no place for a woman and child," he said gruffly, glancing back at his wife's grave. "I live alone. Have done since." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Please," Eleanor whispered. "Just for tonight. We'll be gone by morning. I promise." The setting sun painted the western sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Night was coming, and with it the cold of the high plains. Owen knew the nearest town, Timberline, was a good 15 miles away. Too far for a woman on foot with a baby to reach before dark. "You got any more baggage than what I can see?" he finally asked. Relief flooded her face. "Just this." She gestured to a small cloth sack slung over her shoulder. Owen nodded once, sharply. "Follow me, then. Ranch is about a mile down this trail." As they walked in silence, Owen occasionally glancing back to make sure Eleanor was keeping up, he wondered what kind of trouble she was in. A young mother, alone, with no husband in sight and nothing but a baby and a small sack to her name. Nothing good could have led her to this situation. The ranch came into view as they crested a small rise, a modest log cabin with a barn and corral nearby, nestled in a valley with a creek running along its eastern edge. It wasn't much, but it was solid, built by Owen's own hands 5 years ago when he and Sarah had first claimed this land. "It's not fancy," Owen said as they approached the cabin, "but it's dry and warm." "It's perfect," Eleanor replied, and he could hear genuine gratitude in her voice. Inside, the cabin was sparse but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rough-hewn table and chairs nearby. A curtain partitioned off what Eleanor presumed was the sleeping area. Owen busied himself lighting a fire while Eleanor stood awkwardly in the center of the room, the baby now fussing in her arms. "You can sit," Owen said, nodding toward one of the chairs. "I'll heat some stew. It's venison. Shot the deer myself yesterday." "Thank you," Eleanor said, sinking gratefully into the chair. "Thomas needs changing. Is there somewhere I could?" Owen gestured toward the curtained area. "Sarah's things are still in the trunk at the foot of the bed. Might be something you could use." Eleanor disappeared behind the curtain, and Owen stood motionless for a moment, staring at the space where she had been. It had been half a year since a woman had stood in his cabin. Half a year of silence and solitude, broken only by occasional trips into town for supplies or the rare visitor from neighboring homesteads miles away. When Eleanor emerged with a freshly changed baby, Owen had the stew warming over the fire. He wordlessly ladled a generous portion into a bowl and placed it before her. "Eat," he said. "You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." Eleanor didn't need to be told twice. She balanced Thomas in one arm and ate with the other, the hunger evident in every hurried spoonful. Owen sat across from her, nursing a cup of coffee, studying her with guarded curiosity. "Where you headed?" he asked after she'd finished half the bowl. Eleanor hesitated, her spoon pausing midway to her mouth. "West," she finally said. "Maybe California. I've heard there are opportunities there." "California's a long way from here," Owen observed, "especially on foot with a baby. I was hoping to find work in Timberline. Earn enough for stage passage." Owen snorted softly. "Not much work in Timberline for a woman with a child. It's barely more than a wide spot in the road. Few saloons, a general store, a blacksmith." Eleanor's shoulders slumped slightly. "I have to try? We can't go back east." The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Why? But Owen didn't ask. Everyone out here had something they were running from. The West was full of second chances and fresh starts. The baby's father? Owen ventured instead. "Dead," Eleanor replied flatly, her eyes dropping to her bowl. 6 months ago." Whether this was truth or fiction, Owen couldn't tell, but he recognized the wall she'd just thrown up and didn't push further. "You can stay the night," he said, rising to his feet. "I'll sleep in the barn. There are extra blankets in the chest." "Mr. Novak," Eleanor began, but Owen cut her off. "Owen," he corrected. "Just Owen." "Owen," she amended. "I can't thank you enough." He waved away her gratitude. "Get some rest. Morning comes early out here." As Owen crossed the yard to the barn, the stars emerging in the darkening sky above him, he wondered what had possessed him to take in this strange woman and her child. Perhaps it was the memory of Sarah, who would never have turned away someone in need. Or perhaps it was simply that after months of isolation, he was tired of being alone with his ghosts. In the barn, he made a bed of hay in an empty stall and lay back, listening to the familiar sounds of the night, the soft nickering of his horse, the distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of the wind through the cottonwoods along the creek. But tonight, there was something else, the knowledge that inside his cabin, a woman and her child slept under his roof. It was both comforting and unsettling, like putting on an old, familiar coat that no longer quite fits. Sleep came fitfully to Owen that night, his dreams haunted by Sarah's face and the sound of a baby crying. When dawn broke, Owen was already awake, tending to his horse and mentally planning the day's chores. He had half expected Eleanor to make good on her promise and be gone by first light, but as he approached the cabin, he could smell coffee brewing. He paused at the door, taking a deep breath before pushing it open. Eleanor stood at the stove, Thomas secured in a makeshift sling across her chest. The table was set with 2 tin plates, and she was tending to a pan of frying bacon. "Good morning," she said, glancing over her shoulder. "I hope you don't mind. I thought the least I could do was prepare breakfast." Owen removed his hat, hanging it on a peg by the door. "Didn't expect you to still be here," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I was hoping," Eleanor began, then seemed to lose her nerve. She busied herself with the bacon for a moment before continuing. "I was thinking about what you said, about there not being much work in Timberline. I wondered if perhaps you might need help here, just until I can earn enough to move on." Owen stood frozen in the doorway. The idea of sharing his space, his daily routine, with this woman and her child sent a wave of panic through him. He'd grown accustomed to his solitude, to the predictable rhythm of his days. "I'm a hard worker," Eleanor pressed on when Owen didn't immediately respond. "I can cook, clean, mend. I grew up on a farm in Ohio, so I know my way around livestock. And I wouldn't expect much, just room and board for Thomas and me, and perhaps a small wage when you can spare it." Owen moved to the table and sat heavily in one of the chairs. "Why would you want to stay here? Middle of nowhere with a stranger?" Eleanor turned to face him fully, her expression earnest. "Because you're the first person who's shown us any kindness since Thomas was born. Because your land is beautiful and peaceful. Because I think you could use the help, and I desperately need somewhere safe to stay." The word safe caught Owen's attention. "You in some kind of trouble?" A shadow passed over Eleanor's face. "Not the kind that would bring danger to your door," she said carefully. But yes, there are reasons I can't go back east. Owen studied her for a long moment. The sensible thing would be to send her on her way. His life was complicated enough without adding a mysterious woman and her baby to the mix. But something in her eyes, a determination, a quiet strength that reminded him of Sarah, made him hesitate. Trial basis, he heard himself saying. 2 weeks. Then we'll see. The relief that washed over Eleanor's face was palpable. Thank you, she said, the simple words laden with genuine gratitude. You won't regret it. But as they sat down to breakfast, the baby now sleeping peacefully in the sling, Owen wasn't entirely sure he believed her. The first few days of their arrangement were awkward, with Owen and Eleanor navigating around each other like wary animals sharing territory. Owen spent most of his time outside, tending to the small herd of cattle he kept, mending fences, and hunting. Eleanor transformed the inside of the cabin, cleaning every surface until it gleamed, organizing the sparse supplies, and turning the simple shelter into something that began to feel like a home again. On the 4th day, Owen returned from checking his western boundary to find Eleanor hanging laundry on a line she'd strung between 2 trees. Thomas lay on a blanket in the shade, gurgling happily at a wooden toy horse Owen recognized as one he'd carved for the child he and Sarah had been expecting. He stopped short, a lump forming in his throat at the sight. Eleanor hadn't asked permission to go through Sarah's things, but he couldn't find it in himself to be angry. The toy had been sitting in a chest gathering dust, waiting for hands that would never hold it. Hope you don't mind, Eleanor said, noticing his gaze. I found it when I was cleaning. Owen shook his head. No, it's good someone's using it. That evening, as they sat at the table eating a rabbit stew Eleanor had prepared, Owen found himself talking more than he had in months. He told her about his journey west from Pennsylvania after the war between the states, about meeting Sarah in a small Kansas town where her father ran the general store, about their dreams of building a cattle empire in the Colorado Territory. Sarah was the brave one, he said, staring into his coffee cup. I was ready to settle in Kansas, but she'd read about the Homestead Act and had her heart set on claiming our own land. Said she wanted to see mountains. She sounds remarkable, Eleanor said softly. Owen nodded. She was. We were only married 3 years when. He couldn't finish the sentence. The fever, Eleanor supplied, remembering what Owen had told her about the grave. Childbed fever, Owen clarified. We were so happy about the baby. Then one day she was fine, and the next. He cleared his throat. Doctor couldn't do anything. Said it happens sometimes. Eleanor's hand reached across the table, briefly touching his before withdrawing. I'm so sorry, Owen. He nodded once, sharply, then changed the subject. Tomorrow I need to ride into Timberline for supplies. You should come along, get to know the area a bit. Eleanor's face paled slightly. I don't think that's a good idea. Thomas doesn't do well on long journeys, and someone should stay to watch the place. Owen studied her reaction with interest. Timberline's the closest town. Sooner or later, you'll need to go there. Later, then, Eleanor said with forced lightness. When Thomas is a bit older. Owen didn't press the issue, but he filed away her reluctance as another piece of the puzzle that was Eleanor Lawson. The next morning, Owen prepared to ride into town. Eleanor had written out a list of supplies they needed: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, and a few other necessities. As Owen was saddling his horse, Eleanor appeared in the barn doorway, Thomas sleeping against her shoulder. Be careful, she said. Owen glanced at her, surprised by the concern in her voice. Always am. It's just. She hesitated. If someone asks about us, about Thomas and me, would you mind not mentioning we're here? Owen's hand stilled on the saddle strap. You expecting someone to be looking for you? Eleanor bit her lip. Probably not this far west. But just in case. Someone who'd mean you harm? Yes, she admitted softly. Owen straightened, fixing her with a steady gaze. I think it's time you told me what kind of trouble you're in, Eleanor. She sighed, adjusting Thomas in her arms. Thomas's father wasn't my husband, she began. He was my employer, a wealthy man back in St. Louis. I worked as a housemaid in his home. She paused, seemingly gathering her courage. His wife couldn't have children. When he discovered I was with child, he offered me money to give the baby to them after it was born. I agreed at first. What choice did I have? But after Thomas was born, you couldn't give him up, Owen finished for her. Eleanor nodded. I fled in the night with what little money I had saved. He's been pursuing me ever since. The last I heard, he had hired Pinkerton detectives to find us. Owen let out a low whistle. Pinkertons don't give up easily. I know, Eleanor said, her voice small. That's why I've been moving west, staying off the main routes when possible. But I'm running out of money and options. Owen considered this new information carefully. Harboring a woman who was being hunted by Pinkerton detectives could bring trouble down on his head. The sensible thing would be to tell her she couldn't stay after all. Instead, he found himself saying, I won't mention you in town. But Eleanor, this is a small territory. People talk. Sooner or later, word will get out that I've got a woman and child staying at my ranch. I know, she said. I just need time to figure out what to do next. Owen mounted his horse, looking down at Eleanor and the sleeping baby. In the morning sunlight, they made a beautiful picture, one that stirred something long dormant in his chest. We'll figure it out, he said, surprising himself with the we. I'll be back before sundown. The ride into Timberline took nearly 3 hours at a steady pace. The town had grown since Owen had last visited, with new buildings springing up along the main street. The railroad hadn't reached them yet, but rumors suggested it would within the next year or two, and speculators were already buying up land in anticipation. Owen tied his horse in front of Jensen's general store and went inside to fill Eleanor's list. Frank Jensen, a portly man with a magnificent mustache, greeted him warmly. Owen Novak, been a while since we've seen you in these parts. How's life treating you out there on that lonely spread of yours? Well enough, Owen replied, handing over the list. Need these items. Frank glanced at the list, his eyebrows rising slightly. Sugar, tea, flour. You taking up baking, Owen? Owen's face remained impassive. Just stocking up. Frank began gathering the items, still chatting. Heard there was some excitement over in Durango last week. Pinkerton men came through, asking questions about a young woman traveling with an infant. Apparently, she's wanted back east for theft. Stole a baby, if you can believe it. Owen's hand tightened on the counter. That's so. Frank nodded, weighing out flour into a sack. Said she was a pretty little thing, blonde hair, traveling alone with a baby boy, offering a substantial reward for information leading to her recovery. World's full of desperate people, Owen commented neutrally. That it is, Frank agreed. Though I can't imagine what would drive a woman to steal someone else's child. Owen didn't respond, but his mind was racing. Eleanor's story and the one being circulated by the Pinkertons couldn't both be true. One was a lie, and Owen had to decide which one he believed. After paying for the supplies and loading them onto his horse, Owen visited the saloon for a quick drink and to listen for any additional news. The talk was mostly about the coming railroad and a recent skirmish with a small band of Ute warriors who had attacked a stagecoach near the Utah border. No further mention of Pinkerton detectives or missing women and babies. As Owen mounted up for the ride home, he noticed a fresh wanted poster nailed to the board outside the sheriff's office. The sketch wasn't particularly detailed, but it showed a young woman with a baby. The text below identified her as Eleanor Lawson, a slight misspelling of the name she'd given him, and offered a $500 reward for information leading to her capture, dead or alive. Owen tore the poster down, crumpled it, and stuffed it into his saddlebag before riding out of town, his thoughts as turbulent as the gathering storm clouds on the horizon. The rain began when he was still an hour from the ranch, a gentle patter at first that quickly became a downpour. By the time the cabin came into view, Owen was soaked to the skin and in a foul mood. The sight of smoke rising from the chimney and lamplight glowing in the windows eased his temper somewhat, reminding him that for the first time in months, someone was waiting for his return. Eleanor met him at the door with a towel and a cup of hot coffee. You're drenched. Come sit by the fire while I unload the supplies. I'll handle the horse and supplies, Owen said, taking the coffee gratefully. You stay dry. When he returned from the barn, Eleanor had a hot bath waiting for him behind the partition, a luxury he hadn't indulged in since Sarah's death. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched him deeply. After he'd bathed and changed into dry clothes, Owen found Eleanor at the table, mending one of his shirts. Thomas slept in a makeshift cradle she'd fashioned from a wooden crate padded with blankets. Heard some interesting news in town, Owen said, watching her face carefully as he sat down across from her. Eleanor's needle paused mid-stitch. Oh, seems the Pinkertons are looking for a woman who stole a baby from a wealthy family back east. Eleanor's face drained of color. That's not true, she whispered. No. Owen reached into his pocket and withdrew the crumpled wanted poster, smoothing it on the table between them. They're offering $500 for your capture, dead or alive. Eleanor stared at the poster, her hands trembling. He's calling me a kidnapper? Is that what you are? Owen asked, his voice carefully neutral. No. Eleanor's eyes flashed with sudden anger. Thomas is my son. Mine and Edward Lawson's. The wealthy man from St. Louis? Yes. Eleanor set aside her mending and met Owen's gaze directly. I told you the truth, Owen. Edward seduced me, got me with child, then tried to buy Thomas from me as if he were a piece of property to be given to his barren wife. When I refused, he threatened to have me arrested for theft of household items. Said no one would believe a servant over a respected businessman. So I ran. Owen studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. Why should I believe you over what the law is saying? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. Look at Thomas, she said. Look at his eyes, his nose, his chin. He has my features, Owen. Would a wealthy family pursuing a kidnapped child misidentify the mother so badly that they'd offer a reward for the wrong woman? The poster doesn't even spell my name correctly. Owen had to admit she had a point. And something about her story rang true, the desperation of a woman with no power against a man with plenty of it. I'll never let them take him, Eleanor said fiercely, glancing at the sleeping baby. He's all I have in this world. The conviction in her voice moved something in Owen. He reached across the table and took the wanted poster, then rose and tossed it into the fire, watching as the flames consumed it. Not all you have, he said quietly. Not anymore. Eleanor looked up at him, hope and gratitude shining in her tear-filled eyes. You believe me? I do, Owen confirmed. But Eleanor, if the Pinkertons are circulating these posters throughout the territory, it's only a matter of time before someone connects you to me. We need to think about what to do when that happens. Eleanor nodded, wiping away her tears. I've been thinking about that. There's really only one solution that would protect both Thomas and me. What's that? Owen asked. We need to make it appear as though I have a legitimate reason to be here. A reason no one would question. Owen frowned, not following her meaning. Eleanor took a deep breath. If I were your wife, no one would think twice about me living here with my child. They would assume Thomas was yours as well. The Pinkertons would have no claim on him. Owen stared at her, stunned. You're proposing marriage? We barely know each other. A marriage of convenience. Eleanor clarified quickly. In name only. It would protect Thomas and give me legal standing if Edward ever found us. A husband's rights supersede an employer's claims. Owen ran a hand through his damp hair, trying to process the suggestion. That's a serious step, Eleanor. I know, she said softly. And I wouldn't ask if I could think of any other way. But I'm desperate, Owen. I can't lose my son. The rain pounded on the roof as Owen considered her proposal. Marriage to Eleanor would certainly complicate his life, but it would also end his solitude. In the short time she'd been here, the cabin had become a home again. Thomas's innocent presence had brought a lightness to the place that had been missing since Sarah's death. Let me think on it, he finally said. It's not a decision to make hastily. Eleanor nodded, relief evident in her expression. At least he hadn't refused outright. Of course. Thank you for even considering it. That night, as Owen lay in his bed, Eleanor had insisted he reclaim it. While she slept on a pallet near the fire with Thomas, he found himself remembering the early days with Sarah. Their marriage had begun as one of love, but also of practical partnership. Out here, a man alone and a woman alone both faced nearly insurmountable challenges. Together, they stood a chance. Could he enter into such a partnership again, this time with a woman he barely knew? A woman who brought with her complications and potential danger? But as he drifted toward sleep, Owen realized that for the first time in 6 months, he was thinking about the future rather than the past. Whether that was a step forward or merely a different kind of trouble, only time would tell. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having moved east overnight. Owen rose early, as was his habit, and found Eleanor already awake, nursing Thomas by the freshly stoked fire. Morning, he said, keeping his eyes averted to give her privacy. "Good morning," she replied, adjusting her clothing as Thomas finished his meal. "I've been thinking about yesterday's conversation." "As have I," Owen admitted, pouring himself a cup of coffee from the pot Eleanor had prepared. "If it's too much to ask," she began, but Owen cut her off. "I'll do it," he said simply. "I'll marry you, Eleanor. For Thomas's protection and your own." Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you certain?" "I don't want you to feel obligated. I've made my decision," Owen said firmly. "We can ride into town next week to see the preacher. Until then, if anyone comes asking, we'll say we're already married." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." "No need for thanks," Owen replied, suddenly uncomfortable with the emotion of the moment. "It's a practical arrangement, as you said." But as he headed out to begin the day's chores, Owen wondered if either of them truly believed that. The days leading up to their trip to town fell into a comfortable routine. Owen worked from sunrise to sunset, mending fences, tending to the cattle, and hunting for fresh meat. Eleanor transformed the cabin, using her considerable domestic skills to create a warm, welcoming home. She discovered an old vegetable garden that Sarah had started, now overgrown with weeds, and set about reclaiming it, planting seeds she'd found stored in the barn. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation. Owen found himself telling Eleanor stories of his time as a Union soldier during the war, of his journey west afterward, of the early years with Sarah as they established their homestead. Eleanor spoke of her childhood on an Ohio farm, of her parents' deaths from influenza when she was 16, of her journey to St. Louis in search of work. She was more reticent about her time in Edward Lawson's household, but Owen gathered it had been a lonely existence, with Eleanor an invisible presence except when Lawson sought her out for his own purposes. "When did you realize you were with child?" Owen asked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in hues of gold and purple. Thomas slept in Eleanor's arms, his tiny hand curled around one of her fingers. "About 2 months after the first time," Eleanor replied, her voice low. "I was terrified." Unmarried women who find themselves in that condition generally don't fare well. "When I told Edward, I expected him to dismiss me immediately. Instead, he seemed pleased." Owen frowned. "Pleased?" Eleanor nodded. "That's when he proposed his arrangement." His wife, Caroline, had suffered multiple miscarriages. The doctors had told them she would likely never carry a child to term. Edward said if I agreed to give them my baby after it was born, he would provide for me generously. Set me up in a small house, give me an allowance. "But you refused?" "Not at first," Eleanor admitted. "I agreed, thinking it might be best for the child. What could I offer as a single mother with no family, no resources? But as my time grew closer, I began to have doubts. Then Thomas was born, and the moment they placed him in my arms." Her voice broke. "I knew I could never give him up. Not for any amount of money." Owen understood. He'd felt the same fierce protectiveness toward the child he and Sarah had been expecting. "So you ran." "That night," Eleanor confirmed. "I took what little money I had saved, some food from the kitchen, and the clothes on my back. We've been running ever since." Owen was silent for a moment, processing her story. "This Edward Lawson," he finally said. "He must be a powerful man to have the Pinkertons at his disposal. One of the wealthiest men in St. Louis," Eleanor said grimly. "Banking, railroads, shipping. The kind of man who gets what he wants, one way or another." "Not this time," Owen said, surprising himself with the fierceness in his voice. "Not Thomas." Eleanor looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears in the fading light. "Thank you, Owen, for believing me, for helping us." Owen nodded once, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He rose from his chair. "We should turn in. Long day tomorrow." But that night, as he lay in bed listening to Eleanor's soft breathing and the occasional sigh from Thomas across the room, Owen found himself thinking about the kind of man who would treat a woman as Edward Lawson had treated Eleanor, as a convenience, a means to an end rather than a person with feelings and dignity. It stirred a protective anger in him that he hadn't felt in a long time. The following week, they made preparations to travel into Timberline. Owen had concerns about Eleanor being recognized, but she fashioned a simple disguise, darkening her blonde hair with walnut stain and wearing a wide-brimmed bonnet that shadowed her face. They agreed on a story. They had been married for over a year, but Eleanor had been living with family back east while Owen established their homestead. Thomas, born during that separation, was now 6 months old, and Eleanor had finally joined her husband in Colorado. Do you think anyone will believe it? Eleanor asked as she adjusted her bonnet in the small mirror Owen had hung by the door. People out here mind their own business for the most part, Owen replied. And there's nothing unusual about a wife joining her husband after a separation. Happens all the time. They set out early, Eleanor and Thomas riding in a small wagon Owen had repaired for the occasion, with Owen on horseback alongside them. The journey seemed shorter than usual to Owen, perhaps because of the companionship. He found himself pointing out landmarks to Eleanor, the lightning-struck pine that marked the halfway point to town, the rocky outcropping where mountain lions sometimes sunned themselves, the bend in the creek where the trout were most plentiful. As they approached timberline, Owen could sense Eleanor's nervousness in the rigid set of her shoulders and the tight grip she maintained on Thomas. It'll be fine, he assured her. Just let me do most of the talking. The town was bustling with midday activity when they arrived. Owen helped Eleanor down from the wagon, then took Thomas from her arms, surprising her. The baby looked up at him with curious eyes, then reached for Owen's beard with a chubby hand. Owen couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. Practicing my fatherly duties, he said quietly to Eleanor. For appearance's sake. Their first stop was the church, a modest wooden structure at the edge of town. The Reverend Thomas Miller was tending his small garden when they approached. He straightened, wiping soil from his hands onto his trousers. Owen Novak, he said warmly. Haven't seen you at services in quite some time. Been occupied with the ranch, Owen replied. Reverend, this is Eleanor Lawson. And this little fellow is Thomas. The Reverend's eyebrows rose slightly as he took in the small family. I see. A pleasure to meet you both. We've come to be married, Owen stated directly. Today, if possible. Reverend Miller's surprise was evident. Married? But you introduced her as, it's complicated, Owen interrupted. Eleanor and I have been together for some time. Thomas is our son. We want to make things right before God. Understanding dawned on the Reverend's face. I see, he said again, though his tone suggested mild disapproval at their presumed sin. Well, I suppose we could arrange a ceremony this afternoon. You'll need witnesses, of course. Can you provide them? Owen asked. We don't know many people in town. The Reverend nodded. Mrs. Miller can stand as one. Perhaps Frank Jensen from the general store for the other? He's a church elder. Owen agreed, and arrangements were made for a ceremony at 4 o'clock. With several hours to spare, Owen led Eleanor to the general store to purchase the supplies they needed. As they entered, Frank Jensen looked up from his ledger, his eyes widening at the sight of Owen with a woman and baby. Well, I'll be, he exclaimed. Owen Novak with a family in tow. Never thought I'd see the day. Owen made the introductions, sticking to their agreed-upon story. Frank seemed to accept it readily enough, though his eyes lingered curiously on Eleanor's shadowed face. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Novak, he said, extending a hand. Eleanor tensed beside Owen. We're not officially married yet, Owen interjected quickly. That's why we're in town. Ceremonies this afternoon. Frank's bushy eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. Is that so? Well, congratulations are in order then. As Frank gathered their supplies, chatting amiably, Owen noticed a fresh wanted poster tacked to the wall behind the counter. From where he stood, he could make out Eleanor's sketch, though the poor quality of the drawing and Eleanor's disguise made it unlikely anyone would make the connection. Eleanor noticed it too, her hand tightening on Owen's arm. He gave her a reassuring squeeze in return. Quite the excitement around here lately, Frank commented as he weighed out flour. Those Pinkerton detectives came through again yesterday, still looking for that woman who kidnapped the baby. Owen felt Eleanor stiffen beside him. Any sign of her? He asked casually. Frank shook his head. Not that I've heard. Though one of them did mention they believe she might be in this general area. Said they found evidence she'd passed through Denver about a month ago, heading south. That's so. Owen kept his voice neutral. Well, I hope they find her. Child stealing is a serious matter. Indeed it is, Frank agreed solemnly. Though between you and me, something about their story doesn't quite ring true. Why would a woman steal just one child, and why travel all this way with it? Seems odd. Owen was surprised by Frank's skepticism. Perhaps there's more to the story than they're letting on. Perhaps, Frank nodded. Oh well, not our concern, is it? Now, about this wedding of yours, I'd be honored to stand as witness, if you'll have me. The Reverend already suggested you. Owen confirmed. 4 o'clock at the church. With their purchases completed, Owen and Eleanor made their way to the town's small restaurant for a meal. Throughout lunch, Owen could see Eleanor's eyes darting nervously to every new person who entered, her body tense as a drawn bowstring. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his own. Relax, he said quietly. No one suspects anything. Eleanor managed a shaky smile. I'm trying. It's just seeing that poster, knowing they're so close. After today, you'll be Eleanor Novak, my lawfully wedded wife, Owen reminded her. That changes everything. The wedding ceremony itself was brief and simple. Eleanor wore her cleanest dress, a faded blue cotton with a lace collar that she'd mended carefully. Owen had shaved and donned his only good shirt. Thomas, freshly bathed and dressed in a clean gown, slept peacefully in Mrs. Miller's arms during the proceedings. As they stood before Reverend Miller, exchanging vows they had practiced on the ride to town, Owen was struck by the solemnity of the moment. These were the same words he had spoken to Sarah 5 years earlier, with all the hope and love of a younger man. Now he spoke them again, to a woman he barely knew, for reasons of protection and practicality rather than passion. Yet when the time came to place the simple gold band on Eleanor's finger, his mother's ring, which Sarah had worn and which Owen had retrieved from his trunk, that morning he found his hand trembling slightly. And when the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, instructing Owen to kiss his bride, the brief touch of Eleanor's lips against his sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. After the ceremony, Frank Jensen insisted on hosting a small celebration at the restaurant, where he ordered a special dinner and even produced a bottle of champagne for the occasion. Throughout the meal, Owen played the part of the proud husband and father, keeping a protective arm around Eleanor's shoulders and occasionally bouncing Thomas on his knee. If anyone thought it strange that Owen Novak had suddenly appeared with a wife and child after months of solitude, they kept their opinions to themselves. As they prepared to depart, the setting sun casting long shadows down Timberline's Main Street, Reverend Miller pulled Owen aside. I've known you since you first came to these parts, Owen, he said quietly. I performed your wedding ceremony to Sarah, and I conducted her funeral service. I don't know the full story of what's happening here, but I trust you're doing what you believe is right. Owen met the older man's gaze steadily. I am, Reverend. Eleanor and Thomas need protection, and I'm in a position to provide it. The Reverend nodded slowly. Marriage is a sacred covenant, Owen, regardless of the circumstances that led to it. Treat it as such. I will, Owen promised, suddenly aware of the weight of the commitment he had just made. The journey back to the ranch was quieter than the trip into town, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Thomas slept soundly in Eleanor's arms, exhausted from the day's excitement. As the wagon crested the final hill, the cabin came into view. A single window glowing with lamplight. Eleanor had thoughtfully left a lamp burning for their return. Home, Owen said, the word feeling strange on his tongue after so many months of emptiness. Eleanor glanced at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Yes, she agreed softly. Home. As Owen helped his new wife and stepson down from the wagon, he wondered what Sarah would think of the day's events. Would she approve of his actions, of his decision to protect this young woman and her child? He liked to think she would. Sarah had always had a generous heart and a strong sense of justice. Inside the cabin, everything looked the same, yet somehow different. The marriage certificate Reverend Miller had provided lay on the table where Owen had placed it before they departed for the barn to care for the horse and unload their supplies. That single document had transformed them from two strangers sharing a space to a legal family. What happens now? Eleanor asked as she laid a sleeping Thomas in his makeshift cradle. Owen removed his hat, hanging it on the peg by the door. Now we live as though this is real, he said, in case anyone comes calling. Eleanor nodded, her expression solemn. And our sleeping arrangements. Owen felt heat rise in his face. I'll continue to use the bed. You and Thomas can have the pallet by the fire. Unless, he hesitated. Unless appearances require otherwise. That seems sensible, Eleanor agreed, though Owen thought he detected a hint of relief in her voice. Thank you again, Owen, for everything you've done today. No need for thanks between husband and wife, Owen replied, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. As he prepared for sleep that night, Owen reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. A month ago, he had been a widower, alone with his grief and his work, with no thought beyond surviving each day. Now he was a married man again, stepfather to a baby boy, protector of a woman fleeing a powerful enemy. The responsibility should have felt overwhelming, yet somehow it didn't. Instead, there was a curious sense of rightness to it all, as though the empty spaces in his life were gradually being filled again. With that thought, Owen drifted into the most peaceful sleep he'd had in months. The weeks that followed saw Owen and Eleanor settling into a domestic routine that began to feel increasingly natural. They worked side by side during the days, Owen tending to the cattle and the outer boundaries of the property, Eleanor managing the household and the vegetable garden she had revived. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation, getting to know each other in the way most couples did before marriage rather than after. Owen discovered that Eleanor had a quick mind and a quiet sense of humor that emerged more frequently as she grew comfortable in her new surroundings. She was well read for a woman of her background, having taken advantage of Edward Larson's extensive library during her employment in his household. She spoke knowledgeably about literature, history, and even politics, topics Sarah had never shown much interest in. For her part, Eleanor learned that beneath Owen's gruff exterior lay a thoughtful, principled man with unexpected depths. He could recite poetry he had memorized during long watches as a Union soldier. He carved beautiful wooden figures with skilled hands that belied their size and strength. And most surprisingly to Eleanor, he had a gentle way with Thomas that the baby responded to with increasing delight. One evening, about a month after their wedding, Owen returned from checking the cattle to find Eleanor standing in the doorway of the cabin, her face tight with concern. "Riders coming," she said without preamble. "Two of them, from the north." Owen squinted in the direction she indicated, making out two figures on horseback approaching at a steady pace. "Get inside," he instructed. "Keep Thomas quiet." Eleanor obeyed immediately, disappearing into the cabin while Owen waited in the yard, one hand resting casually on the revolver at his hip. As the riders drew closer, he recognized one of them as Sheriff James Wilson from Timberline. The other was a stranger, well dressed in a manner that suggested he wasn't from around these parts. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Owen called as the men reined in their horses. "What brings you out this way?" Sheriff Wilson, a weathered man in his 50s with a gray-streaked beard, touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Owen, this here is Mr. Howard Reed. He's a Pinkerton detective with some questions for you." Owen kept his expression neutral as he nodded to the detective. "Mr. Reed, what can I help you with?" Reed dismounted, a slim man with sharp features and calculating eyes. "Mr. Novak, I understand you recently married a woman named Eleanor, who has a young baby." "That's correct," Owen confirmed. "My wife and son are inside if you'd like to meet them." Reed exchanged a glance with the sheriff. "I would indeed. We're looking for a woman who may be using the name Eleanor Lawson. She's wanted for kidnapping an infant from a prominent St. Louis family. My wife's name was Eleanor Lawson before our marriage," Owen said evenly. "But she's been with me for over a year now. Thomas is our son." Reed's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is that so? According to our information, you were a widower living alone until quite recently." "My first wife, Sarah, died last year," Owen acknowledged. "Eleanor was living with her family back east while I established our home here. She joined me this spring after Thomas was born." "A convenient story," Reed remarked. "Would you mind if we spoke with your wife?" "Not at all," Owen replied, though every instinct screamed against allowing this man near Eleanor and Thomas. "Please, come inside." Owen led the way into the cabin, where Eleanor stood near the fireplace, Thomas held protectively against her chest. Her face was composed, but Owen could see the fear in her eyes. "Eleanor, honey, this is Sheriff Wilson from Timberline and Mr. Reed, a Pinkerton detective. They have some questions for you." Eleanor's eyes met Owen's briefly before she turned to the visitors. "Of course. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." The domestic normalcy of the offer seemed to momentarily throw Reed off balance. "No, thank you, Mrs. Novak. I won't take much of your time. I'm investigating the disappearance of an infant from St. Louis. The child was taken by a housemaid named Eleanor Lawson." Eleanor's expression registered appropriate surprise. "How terrible. But I don't understand what this has to do with me." Reed studied her face intently. "You bear a striking resemblance to the woman we're seeking. And your name before marriage was Lawson, correct?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "But I've never been to St. Louis, and I've certainly never worked as a housemaid. I grew up on a farm in Ohio. Owen and I met when he passed through on his way west 3 years ago." Thomas chose that moment to fuss, turning his face into Eleanor's neck. As she soothed him, Reed's gaze fixed on the baby. "May I see the child?" he asked abruptly. Eleanor's arms tightened instinctively around Thomas. "He's tired and cranky at the moment. Perhaps another time." "It wasn't a request, Mrs. Novak," Reed said, his voice hardening. Sheriff Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Reed, there's no need to upset the lady. It's all right, Sheriff," Owen interjected, moving to stand beside Eleanor. "Mr. Reed is just doing his job. Eleanor, show him Thomas." With visible reluctance, Eleanor turned Thomas in her arms so that his face was visible to the detective. Reed leaned in, examining the baby's features closely. Thomas stared back at him with Eleanor's blue eyes before his face crumpled and he began to wail in earnest. "Doesn't much care for strangers," Owen commented mildly as Eleanor rocked Thomas, murmuring soothing words. Reed straightened, his expression unreadable. "The child I'm looking for would be approximately the same age," he said. "Though the description I have mentions darker hair. Baby's hair color often changes in the first year," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than Owen would have expected. "Thomas was born with dark hair, but it's lightening as he grows." Reed looked around the cabin, taking in the modest but well-kept interior. His gaze lingered on the curtained-off sleeping area, then moved to the marriage certificate framed on the wall, Owen's idea, to reinforce their story. "Do you have any documentation of the child's birth?" Reed asked. "A certificate, perhaps." "Not with us," Owen replied. "As I mentioned, Thomas was born back east. The papers are with Eleanor's family for safekeeping." Reed's mouth tightened slightly. "That's unfortunate. It would help clear up this matter quickly." "Mr. Reed," Sheriff Wilson intervened, "I've known Owen Novak for years. He's a respectable rancher and a man of his word. If he says this is his son, I'm inclined to believe him." Reed didn't look convinced, but he nodded curtly. "Very well. For now." He turned back to Eleanor. "Mrs. Novak, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to take a closer look at your left wrist." Eleanor paled slightly. "My wrist. The woman I'm seeking has a distinctive birthmark there. A small, dark circle about the size of a dime." Owen felt a chill run through him. He had noticed such a mark on Eleanor's wrist their first night together, when she had rolled up her sleeves to wash dishes. With remarkable composure, Eleanor handed Thomas to Owen, then extended her left arm, pushing up her sleeve to reveal unmarked skin. Owen blinked in confusion, then noticed the faint smudge of what might have been face powder or flour on her wrist. Reed examined her arm carefully, then released it. "I apologize for the intrusion, Mrs. Novak. It seems I was mistaken." "Not at all," Eleanor replied, her voice admirably steady. "I hope you find the woman and child you're looking for." As Owen walked the men back to their horses, Reed hung back slightly, speaking in a low voice that wouldn't carry to the cabin. "I'm not entirely convinced by your story, Mr. Novak. The timing is suspiciously convenient." Owen met the detective's gaze squarely. "My wife and son are exactly who I say they are, Mr. Reed. I'd appreciate it if you direct your investigation elsewhere." Reed studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "For now, but I'll be watching. If I find evidence that you're harboring a fugitive and a stolen child, you'll face charges as an accomplice." "Understood," Owen replied evenly. "Good day, gentlemen." He watched as the two men rode away, maintaining his calm demeanor until they disappeared from sight. Then he hurried back to the cabin, where he found Eleanor sitting at the table, her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Thomas lay in his cradle, oblivious to the danger that had just passed. "Eleanor," Owen said softly, laying a hand on her shoulder. "They're gone." She looked up, her face streaked with tears. He knew Owen. He knew about the birthmark. Edward must have told them. But you covered it somehow, Owen said, taking her left wrist gently in his hand and rubbing at the spot with his thumb. The powder came away, revealing the small, dark circle beneath. Face powder, Eleanor confirmed. I've been covering it since we got married, just in case. I never thought they'd actually come here. Owen pulled a chair close to hers and sat down, still holding her wrist. Reed isn't convinced. He as much as told me he'll be watching us. Fresh fear flooded Eleanor's eyes. What do we do? Owen considered their options carefully. We could run, he said slowly. Pack up and head further west. Maybe to California, like you originally planned. But your ranch, everything you've built here, just land and timber, Owen said with a shrug, can be replaced. Eleanor shook her head firmly. No, you've already sacrificed too much for us. I won't let you give up your home too. What then? Eleanor took a deep breath, visibly gathering her courage. We stay? We live exactly as we told them we do as husband and wife, with our son. We make sure every aspect of our life together supports our story. That would mean. Owen trailed off, not sure how to articulate the implications. Sharing a bed. Eleanor finished for him, a blush coloring her cheeks. Being a true family in every way except, well, the most intimate aspects could remain as they are now. Owen felt heat rise in his own face. You would be comfortable with that? More comfortable than with running again, Eleanor said honestly. Thomas deserves a stable home, Owen. And I'm tired of looking over my shoulder, waiting for Edward's men to find us. Owen nodded slowly. All right, we stay, and we commit fully to our roles. If Reed or anyone else comes calling again, they'll find nothing to contradict our story. That night, for the first time, they shared the bed, an awkward arrangement of carefully maintained space between them. Owen lay rigidly on his side, acutely aware of Eleanor's presence beside him, the soft sound of her breathing, the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her hair. It had been so long since he had shared a bed with anyone that the simple proximity of another person felt strange and disorienting. Owen, Eleanor's voice came softly through the darkness. Are you awake? Yes, he replied. I've been thinking about what Reed said. About watching us. What about it? If he's having us observed, we need to be convincing at all times, not just when visitors come calling. We need to act like a real married couple even when we think no one is watching. Owen turned his head slightly toward her, though he could barely make out her profile in the dim light. How do you mean? Small things, Eleanor explained. The way married people touch casually throughout the day, how they stand close to each other, the familiarity that comes from intimacy. Owen swallowed hard. I'm not sure I remember how to do those things. Nor I, Eleanor admitted. I've never been married before. But we can learn together, can't we? For Thomas's sake. For Thomas, Owen agreed, though as he finally drifted toward sleep, he wondered if the boy was the only reason he was willing to try. The next morning brought a new kind of awareness between them. As they moved about the cabin preparing breakfast, Owen made a conscious effort to touch Eleanor in the small way she had described, a hand at the small of her back as he passed behind her, fingers brushing as she handed him a cup of coffee, standing close enough that their shoulders touched while they washed dishes together. Each contact sent a jolt of something like electricity through him, a sensation he hadn't experienced in a very long time. For her part, Eleanor seemed determined to normalize these interactions, responding with smiles and casual touches of her own. By midday, Owen was surprised to find how natural it was beginning to feel, this physical language of marriage they were creating together. The true test came 3 days later when Frank Jensen arrived unexpectedly with a wagon load of supplies and a wedding gift, a handmade quilt from his wife. Owen was out checking the fence line when Frank's wagon appeared, leaving Eleanor to receive the visitor alone. From his position on the ridge overlooking the cabin, Owen saw Frank arrive and Eleanor emerged to greet him, Thomas on her hip. He watched as she welcomed the storekeeper inside, her manner relaxed and hospitable. Leaving his work, Owen headed back toward the cabin, arriving just as Frank was preparing to depart. Owen, Frank called heartily, was just telling your lovely wife how pleased we all are to see you settled again. She's been showing me how she's fixed up the place. Hardly recognized it. Owen removed his hat as he approached, automatically slipping an arm around Eleanor's waist in a gesture that felt surprisingly natural. "Frank, this is unexpected. Figured I'd deliver these supplies myself. Save you a trip to town," Frank explained. "And Martha insisted I bring the quilt. Wedding present, you know." "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, leaning comfortably against Owen's side. "Please thank her for us." As they chatted with Frank, loading the supplies into the barn and showing him the improvements to the property, Owen was impressed by how easily Eleanor maintained their charade. She referred to events in their fictional shared past with complete conviction, laughed at the right moments during Frank's stories about Owen before they'd met, and managed Thomas with the confidence of a mother who had been caring for her child from birth. When Frank finally departed, promising to tell everyone in Timberline how well the newlyweds were faring, Owen turned to Eleanor with newfound respect. "You're quite the actress," he remarked as they walked back to the cabin. Eleanor smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in it. "Necessity is a powerful teacher. I've been pretending to be someone I'm not since I fled St. Louis." "Well, you convinced Frank completely," Owen said. "And Frank Jensen is not an easy man to fool. Do you think he'll tell Reed about his visit?" Owen considered this. Not intentionally, but Reed might question him about us. Frank's impression will help our case. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Thomas asleep in his cradle nearby, Owen found himself studying Eleanor's profile in the golden light. She had filled out somewhat in the months since her arrival, the desperate thinness giving way to healthier curves. Her hair, now returned to its natural blonde after the walnut stain had faded, caught the last rays of the sun like spun gold. "What are you thinking?" Eleanor asked, catching his gaze. Owen hesitated, then decided on honesty. "That you're beautiful," he said simply. A blush rose in Eleanor's cheeks. "Oh," she said softly. "Thank you. I don't say things like that often enough," Owen continued, surprising himself. "Sarah used to complain about it. Said I kept too many thoughts to myself." "She was probably right," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "You're not exactly forthcoming with your feelings." "Never been good at it," Owen admitted. "Words don't come easy to me like they do to some men." "Actions speak louder anyway," Eleanor said. "And your actions have shown me exactly what kind of man you are, Owen Novak." There was something in her voice, a warmth that hadn't been there before, that made Owen's heart beat a little faster. On impulse, he reached over and took her hand in his rough fingers entwining with her smaller ones. They sat like that, hand in hand, until the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. As summer gave way to autumn, the rhythm of ranch life continued. Owen began preparations for winter, repairing the barn roof, stockpiling firewood, and smoking meat for the months when hunting would be more difficult. Eleanor canned vegetables from her garden, made soap from rendered fat and lye, and sewed warmer clothes for all of them from fabric purchased in town. Thomas grew rapidly, his personality emerging more each day. He was a happy, curious baby who delighted in exploration once he learned to crawl. Owen found himself increasingly enchanted by the boy, carving him toys and spending evenings on the floor playing with him, while Eleanor mended or read aloud from one of the few books they owned. Their pretense of marriage gradually evolved into something that felt less like an act and more like reality. The shared bed no longer felt awkward but comfortable, a natural place for conversation at the end of the day. The casual touches that had once been calculated became instinctive. They developed private jokes, familiar routines, and the kind of shorthand communication that develops between people who live in close proximity. If Eleanor noticed Owen watching her when she thought he wasn't looking, she didn't mention it. And if Owen was aware of the way Eleanor's gaze sometimes lingered on him as he worked shirtless in the yard, he gave no indication. In late September, a letter arrived from Reverend Miller, carried by a passing traveler. It contained news of Timberline, a new schoolhouse being built, a marriage, 2 births, 1 death, and a discreet warning. The Pinkerton detective, Reed, had returned to town, asking more questions about the Novaks. "He's not giving up," Eleanor said that night as they sat at the table reading the letter together. "No," Owen agreed. "Men like Reed are paid to be persistent." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she set down the letter. "What if he finds proof? What if he convinces the authorities that I kidnapped Thomas?" Owen reached across the table and took her hand. "That won't happen." How can you be so sure? Because I won't let it happen, Owen stated firmly. Eleanor, you and Thomas are my family now. I protect what's mine. The fierceness in his voice made Eleanor look up sharply. Do you mean that? About us being your family? Owen met her gaze steadily. I do. Something shifted between them in that moment. A subtle but profound change that both could feel, but neither was ready to name. Eleanor squeezed his hand, then rose from the table. It's late, she said. We should get some rest. That night, as they lay in bed with Thomas sleeping in his cradle nearby, Eleanor rolled toward Owen, closing the careful space they usually maintained between them. In the dim light from the banked fire, he could see her eyes searching his face. Owen, she whispered, I need to tell you something. He turned to face her fully. What is it? I'm afraid, she admitted. Not just of Reed and what he might do. I'm afraid of how I feel when I'm with you. Owen's heart began to pound. How do you feel? Safe, she said. Respected. Valued. Things I've never really felt with anyone before. And something else, something I didn't expect to feel again after everything that happened with Edward. What's that? Owen asked, his voice rough with emotion. Desire. Eleanor whispered, the word barely audible in the quiet room. Owen's breath caught in his throat. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he reached out and traced the curve of her cheek with his fingertips. Eleanor, he said, her name a question and an answer all at once. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. I know this started as an arrangement, a way to protect Thomas and me. But it's become something else for me. Something real. For me too. Owen admitted, the words coming easier than he would have expected. I didn't plan on caring for you both so much. Eleanor's eyes opened, meeting his with an intensity that made his chest tighten. What happens now? Instead of answering with words, Owen closed the remaining distance between them and pressed his lips to hers. Unlike the brief, formal kiss they had shared at their wedding, this was a real kiss, tender at first, then deepening as Eleanor responded, her hands coming up to frame his face. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Owen rested his forehead against hers. Now we stop pretending, he said simply. This becomes real in every way. Eleanor smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her entire face. I'd like that, she whispered, before leaning in to kiss him again. That night marked a true beginning for them, a transition from marriage in name to marriage in fact. Their physical union was tender and passionate, a discovery of each other that left them both breathless and wondering why they had waited so long. Afterward, as Eleanor lay with her head on Owen's chest, his arm wrapped securely around her, she felt a peace she had never known before. Do you think Sarah would mind? She asked softly. That you found happiness again? Owen was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. No, he finally said. Sarah loved life too much to want anyone to spend theirs in mourning. She would have liked you, I think. You have her practicality, her strength. I wish I could have known her, Eleanor said truthfully. In a way you do, Owen replied. Everything good about this place, about the life we're building here, Sarah had a hand in creating it. She'll always be a part of that. Eleanor lifted her head to look at him, touched by his words and the sentiment behind them. I love you, Owen Novak, she said, the declaration surprising even herself with its certainty. Owen's eyes widened slightly, then softened. And I love you, Eleanor Novak, he responded, the words feeling right and true on his tongue. Both of you, he added, glancing toward Thomas's cradle. The winter of 1876-1877 was harsh, with heavy snows and bitter cold that kept the small family largely confined to the cabin for weeks at a time. But unlike the previous winter, which Owen had endured in lonely silence, this one was filled with warmth and companionship. They developed new traditions, reading aloud by the fire in the evenings, Sunday dinners with special treats Eleanor managed to create from their limited supplies, music from Owen's harmonica that made Thomas laugh and clap his hands. In the close quarters of the cabin, they grew to know each other completely, strengths and weaknesses, hopes and fears, the small habits and preferences that make up a person's character. They argued occasionally, as all couples do, but always found their way back to each other, their commitment deepening with each reconciliation. By spring, when the snow finally melted and the first green shoots appeared in Eleanor's garden, Thomas was walking, a sturdy little boy with his mother's blue eyes and a vocabulary of a dozen words, including a clear "pa" that made Owen's chest swell with pride every time he heard it. The letter that arrived in April, again delivered by a passing traveler, came as a shock. It was from Sheriff Wilson, informing them that Howard Reed had been killed in a shootout in Denver while pursuing another case. The investigation into the missing Lawson baby had been officially closed, with the Pinkerton agency concluding that the child had likely not survived the harsh winter. Eleanor read the letter with trembling hands, then sank into a chair, tears streaming down her face. "It's over," she whispered. "Truly over. They're not looking for us anymore." Owen knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "You're free, Eleanor. You and Thomas both." She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears and relief. "We could go anywhere now. Do anything. Is that what you want?" Owen asked, a flicker of fear in his chest at the thought of losing them now. Eleanor smiled through her tears, touching his face tenderly. "No," she said firmly. "This is our home. You are our home. I just meant, we don't have to be afraid anymore." The relief that flooded through Owen was so intense it left him lightheaded. He pulled Eleanor into his arms, holding her tightly as years of tension finally released from her body. That night, as they lay together in the darkness, Eleanor whispered, "I want to have another baby. A brother or sister for Thomas. A child that's part of both of us." Owen's heart soared at her words. "Nothing would make me happier," he replied, sealing the promise with a kiss. 5 years later, the Novak ranch had grown considerably. The original cabin had been expanded to include 2 additional rooms. A proper barn now stood where the original modest structure had been. The cattle herd numbered over 50 head, and a small apple orchard was beginning to bear fruit near the creek. On the porch of the house, Eleanor sat in a rocking chair, watching as Owen taught Thomas, now 6, how to throw a lasso. Beside her, 3-year-old Sarah played with a wooden doll her father had carved, while baby James, just 8 months old, slept peacefully in a cradle at her feet. The sound of an approaching wagon drew their attention. As it came into view, Eleanor recognized Frank and Martha Jensen, their regular visitors from Timberline. "Company coming," she called to Owen and Thomas, who abandoned their lesson to join her on the porch. As the Jensen's wagon pulled up to the house, Frank called out cheerfully, "Got a surprise for you, Novaks. Brought someone all the way from back east to see you." A second wagon appeared behind the Jensens, driven by a stranger. Beside him sat a woman in a fine traveling dress, her face obscured by a fashionable hat. Eleanor tensed, old fears surfacing despite the years of safety. Owen's hand came to rest reassuringly on her shoulder as they watched the second wagon approach. The woman stepped down from the wagon without assistance, then turned toward the porch. As she lifted her face, Eleanor gasped in recognition. "Caroline." Caroline Lawson removed her hat, revealing a face older and more careworn than Eleanor remembered, but still handsome. "Hello, Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "It's been a long time." Owen's grip on Eleanor's shoulder tightened slightly. "Who is she?" he asked in a low voice. "Edward Larson's wife," Eleanor replied, her heart racing. "Thomas's legal stepmother, I suppose." Caroline approached the porch slowly, her gaze fixed on Thomas, who had moved to stand protectively beside his mother. "Is this him?" she asked softly. "Is this Thomas?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the fear constricting her throat. Caroline smiled sadly. "He looks like you," she observed. "Not much of Edward in him at all, is there?" "What do you want?" Owen asked directly, stepping forward slightly. "My wife and son have been left in peace for years now. We'd like it to stay that way." Caroline's eyes shifted to Owen, taking in his imposing height and the protective stance he had assumed. "You must be Mr. Novak. I've heard about you." She looked back at Eleanor. "I'm not here to cause trouble, Eleanor. Edward died last winter. Pneumonia." The news hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Edward Lawson, the man whose shadow had loomed over her life for so long, was gone. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said automatically, though she felt nothing of the sort. Caroline's lips twisted in a bitter smile. "Are you?" "I'm not, to be honest. Our marriage was a prison for both of us." She sighed, looking again at Thomas. "I didn't come to bring bad news, though. I came to make things right, if I can." "What do you mean?" Eleanor asked warily. Caroline reached into her handbag and withdrew a thick envelope. Legal documents, she explained, officially relinquishing any claim the Lawson estate might have had on Thomas, plus a trust fund in his name, to be accessed when he turns 21. Eleanor stared at the envelope in disbelief. Why would you do this? Because Edward was wrong, Caroline said simply. I knew it then, but I was too weak to stand against him. He wanted an heir, and he didn't care who he hurt to get one. She looked at Thomas again, her expression softening. But he's clearly where he belongs. With you. With your family. Eleanor descended the porch steps slowly, taking the envelope with trembling hands. Thank you, she whispered. Caroline nodded, then surprised Eleanor by pulling her into a brief embrace. Be happy, she said softly. That's all I ask in return. As Caroline prepared to leave, promising to send occasional letters if they would allow it, Eleanor felt Owen's arm slide around her waist, anchoring her as it had so many times before. You all right? He asked quietly as they watched the wagons disappear down the road. Eleanor leaned into his strength, watching Thomas race back to the lasso he had abandoned, little Sarah toddling after him as fast as her legs could carry her. Baby James stirred in his cradle, making the small grunting sounds that usually preceded waking. Yes, she said, turning to smile up at her husband. I'm more than all right. Owen bent to kiss her, a gesture that still sent a thrill through her after all these years. Me too, he murmured against her lips. As they stood together in the yard of the home they had built, surrounded by the family they had created, Eleanor thought about the desperate young woman who had stood at a cemetery 6 years earlier, asking a grieving stranger for shelter. She had been seeking safety then, a temporary haven from the storm that pursued her. She had found that and so much more: love, belonging, purpose, joy. Ma? Pa? Look, Thomas called, having successfully twirled the lasso over a fence post. I did it. Owen and Eleanor turned together, their faces alight with pride as they called back encouragement to their son. James began to cry in earnest now, and Eleanor moved to tend to him, while Owen swept Sarah up onto his shoulders, the little girl shrieking with delight. This was their life now, ordinary and extraordinary all at once. A life built day by day, choice by choice, from the broken pieces of two separate pasts into something whole and beautiful. A life that had begun with a simple question on a lonely hillside. Can we stay with you tonight? And Owen's answer, though he hadn't known it then, had been the truest one possible, for always.